Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from Quilting is My Therapy, and welcome to the newest episode of the Midnight Quilter. In this video, I'm going to put a Scrappy spin on a traditional block, plus we'll find out just how much of a scrap controller I am. I've got my project, my snacks, and my piecing potion, so let's get to it. For tonight's video, I'm going to be making the Flourish Quilt pattern using these beautiful prints from the Thistle Fabric Collection. This floral-inspired collection features beautiful pinks with saturated purples, some sage greens, and even some cute little sherbet prints. Now I know if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I say I don't really love purple, but I gotta admit, I think it's growing on me, especially when you use it with beautiful soft prints like this. And for the background fabric, I'm going to go with this nice subtle white print. It's just really going to let the other fabrics shine. One extra bonus about this pattern is that it uses a lot of different fabrics in smaller pieces, making it perfect as a scrap quilt. Now, Lord knows I have enough scraps, I should be using them. But what can I say? I just can't resist cutting into a brand new quilt kit. And hey, if you want to quilt along with me, if you want to get the pattern, the fabric, or the quilt kit, just click the link in the description box below. We have all of these available on our website. All right, Angela, enough fabric fondling. Let's get to the cutting. First, let's cut up the background fabric. Nothing too crazy here. I'm just going to cut that fabric into strips and then subcut them into even smaller strips. Once I'm done with that, it's time to start cutting the assorted prints. All the fabrics in this quilt are cut the same way, so I'm going to stack a couple of them on top of each other and then start cutting my strips. These wider strips will be for the granny square blocks, and these thinner strips are going to make up a beautiful frame. Now when I write patterns, I try to use up the fabric as much as possible. The less scraps left over, the better. So for this quilt, we're going to open up the strips and then cut each strip into smaller strips of different widths. The squares are for the granny blocks, these strips are for the frame, and this is for me. What gives this quilt its scrappy, beautiful look is the fact that the fabric placement is random, so I'm organizing the strips on the side by size. Now let's turn this pile of pieces into our beautiful quilt. The star of this block is the granny square in the center. And to make that, first I'm gonna set my background strips aside for just a moment. And I'm gonna pull out my squares of all those beautiful prints. To make the block, I'm gonna need 13 of these squares. And this is where a decision needs to be made. Do I wanna be a scrap controller where I plan out every block and make sure the fabric pairings go together beautifully? We all know quilters like this, right? The ones that get out the colored pencils and make sure that everything looks beautiful, maybe even make a couple test blocks. Or do I wanna go to the other end of that scrap spectrum and go all willy-nilly with it, right? Where I just pick random pieces and put them together, let the prints fall where they may. By the way, willy-nilly has to be one of my favorite words. But I just don't think that the random fabric placement is for me. I tend to overthink it, right? Should this print be next to that print? Do I have too much purple on one side? So that's the problem. I love the look of a quilt where every fabric placement is perfect. I just don't want to take the time to do all that work. It's kind of like how I love a clean house, but I just don't like cleaning. Ugh. But the good news is there's different levels on this scrap spectrum. I'm going to aim for something a little more towards the center. Not everything planned out, but not just all willy-nilly. Instead, I'm going to pick out the fabrics for each block, make sure they look great, and fingers crossed the whole quilt will look fine. So to make my granny square, I'm going to start by laying out my different prints. I'm going to use the same fabric on the outside ring. I think this print is adorable. And then I'm going to do a second fabric for the next ring. That's a little too close to the other print. See, like I said, I'm overthinking it. There we go. So maybe a nice sage green print. Gorgeous. And then a different print in the center. Let's do that one. So to finish my block, I'm going to grab my background strips and start laying them out. putting a strip on each end of my rows. Now there's a lot of different ways that you can go about making the granny square block, but I personally like making the block bigger so I can trim it down to the correct size. I love how it makes me look like I'm a great piecer, even though I'm really not a great piecer. I could be if I took my time, but I just get so impatient. And then for the top and bottom of the block, I'm just gonna add a longer strip of that background fabric. Gorgeous. Now, depending on where you fall on that scrap spectrum, you can make all these blocks different, you can come up with different fabric placement, just play around with it until you like how it looks. But once you get the prints picked out, it's time to sew the blocks together. I guess it's time to get the sewing machine. And I decided, since I gotta sew these strips together, I'm gonna sew like my granny might have and use my featherweight sewing machine. So I'm gonna sew all my pieces into strips first, then I'll press them and then sew the rows together. Well, once I have all those pieces sewed into strips, it's time to press. Now, those who are better at quilting than me like to say press to nest. That's one of my employee Joni's favorite things to say. That just means I'm gonna press those seams away from each other so they nest up nicely and give me those perfect looking points. Now, I could go ahead and think through, okay, this one's gonna go that way and that one's gonna go this way, but to make it easy, I'm gonna press them all the same way and then flip around the rows. I just like to be efficient and quick with it, especially when it comes to the ironing. So I'm just pressing those seams all to one side, easy peasy. Since these rows are symmetrical on both sides, it's no problem to switch them around. Now that's not gonna work with every quilt block, but this one, it just happens to. So right now I have all the seams pressed to one side. I'm just going to flip around every other row. And now when I put the sides together, those seams will nest and look beautiful. And when I sew on the little strips that are on either side of the block, I'm just gonna make sure that it's centered. It'll give me plenty of room when it's time to trim it down. And there's my beautiful granny square block. I know it looks a little weird, but that's because I need to trim it down. So let's do that real quick, and then we can start adding our frames. Now I want to trim this to 12.5 inches, and I do have a 12.5 inch ruler somewhere, a square one. I don't know, I don't want to go mess with it. So I'm going to use my regular ruler to trim that down. This is where we got to do a little bit of quilt math. Good thing I haven't had more than a glass of wine tonight. If I want my block to be 12.5 inches, I'm gonna measure from the center over 6 1/4, because that'd be half of 12.5. But here's the thing. I know myself and I know that I make a lot of mistakes. So I'm actually gonna cut this down to 13 inches just to be safe. That's gonna give me a little extra wiggle room just in case I mismeasure. Once I do that, if it looks good, then I'll just trim 1/4 inch off all the sides. I know it takes a couple more steps, but man, I really don't wanna mess up this block. So I'm just gonna line that ruler along the center. Since it's a 6 1/2 inch ruler, that's gonna give me my 13 inches, and I'm going to trim off the extra. Hate wasting fabric, but it's worth it to have a block that's the correct size. And I'm going to rotate it and do the same on the other side. And then turn that block around and do the same on the other side. And the good thing is, if it's not perfectly square, or if it's a little, wonky, or just not quite right, it's gonna be fine. Once the whole quilt's done, it's gonna look great. And there's my adorable block. I love how centered it is. Looks pretty great to me. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim off that extra 1/2 inch and then be done with it. And look at that cute little block, perfectly trimmed down to the right size. And I even designed the pattern so that these blocks are a little bit smaller and you wouldn't have to worry about making these points match when you sew the frames on later. Love that. All right, well, now that I have my block finished, let's get out our strips and add our frame around the outside. The first border around our block uses strips of background fabric and strips and squares of assorted prints. And here is where my fabric controlling tendencies start to rear their ugly head. When it comes to adding the prints around the corner, I could mix and match the squares and strips, by placing 4 of the print squares and then other strips like this. I'd still get the beautiful corner frame effect, but I like my prints a little bit more organized than that. I don't know what that says about me as a quilter, but I'm going to use the same fabrics in each of the corners. Of course, you don't have to go to this much detail. You can make it as random or as thought out as you prefer. I do love playing with the different prints and kind of visualizing what they'll look like. Let's see, what print should I put in the corner? Let's do you. You're cute. Am I the only one that talks to my fabric? Once I'm happy with the way that looks, I'm going to sew the strips into rows and then sew them to the granny square. Once I'm done with the first border, it's time to add the next border around, doing the same thing. And just like I did before, I'm going to keep the fabric the same in the corners. But of course, you willy-nilly piecers out there could do it differently. I don't know, I just like playing with the prints and seeing which one I think would look perfect where. I think I'm gonna put this one over there. Honestly, it is a little kind of weird that I would worry so much about fabric placement because I'm not really particular in other areas of my life. But for some reason, I just want the prints where I want them. The thing I have to watch out for though is if I'm not careful, I'll use all my favorite prints in like 3 of the blocks, and then the rest of them will have prints that I don't love as much. Not that I don't love all the prints in this fabric collection, but let's be honest, we have our favorites, don't we? Perfecto. So I'm gonna do the same thing I did on the last one, just sewing those pieces together and then sewing them to the block. And it might seem like there's a lot of little pieces here, but it's gonna make this quilt look way more intricate than it is, and none of the points actually have to match, so it's pretty mindless and fun. I'm making one block at a time just so you can kind of see how it goes together, but if you want to make the piecing a little bit more efficient, you can sew multiple blocks together. And once that's finished, I have one last border. This one's not gonna get any background strips, it's just gonna get some thinner strips of prints and then some thicker strips. Beautiful. I'm loving the granny square in the center and the pieced frame on the outside. So let me get this piece together and we'll see what the finished block looks like. And there is my finished block. I made the strips on the side a little bit narrower so that the quilt wouldn't be square. I know that not all quilters love square quilts. But besides that, I love how the prints are the same in the corners and how they all come together to make just a beautiful looking block. Now all I need to do is repeat that to make a total of 9 blocks, lay them out, and I'll have my finished quilt. So let me do that and I'll show you what it looks like. And check out my finished Flourish quilt. It's amazing how the fabric placements make the blocks look completely different. To make the quilt top, all I did was make 9 of the blocks, lay them out in rows, and sew them together. I love how all the strips in the corners come together to make a secondary type of block. And even though picking out the prints for the individual blocks can be a little stressful, the quilt top comes together nice and quickly, making it the perfect quilt to bring a little sunshine in your life. Whether you control the fabric placement of your quilt like I did, or go with a totally random fabric placement like this rainbow quilt example, either way, the quilt is gonna look amazing. And don't forget, you can get your hands on the pattern, the kit, or the fabric, and soon you'll have your own Flourish quilt. So what about you? How much of a scrap controller are you? Let me know in the comments. And I'll be back soon with another episode of The Midnight Quilter. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.